In the quiet desert of Arizona, where the sun seems to burn away every trace of the past, 6 girls vanished without a trace one summer night in 1995. Their laughter, their dreams, swallowed whole by shadows no one dared to chase. For 20 years, their parents clung to hope, their hearts echoing with the memories of daughters lost. But then, a single earring unearthed in the sand, a battered cassette tape, and a voice, soft, desperate, refusing to be silenced. What really happened that night, and how far will a mother go to bring the truth to light? Stay with us to uncover a story of darkness, deception, and a final reckoning that will leave you breathless. Emily Brooks sat alone at the worn oak table in her kitchen, fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that once bore cheerful sunflowers, now faded with years of dish soap and quiet despair. The Arizona morning light spilled through the thin curtains, casting a lattice of sunbeams and shadows across the floor, a delicate dance she'd watched every day for 20 years, a ritual of numb routine. The air smelled faintly of toasted bread and the lemon-scented polish she'd used earlier, a futile attempt to keep life feeling normal, as if routine could ever fill the void that Sophie and Lucy's absence had left behind. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Emily's hand lingered on the cup anyway, seeking comfort in the warmth that no longer existed. She let her mind drift, as she so often did, to the memory of the last day she saw her daughters. Their laughter still echoed in the quiet spaces of the house, a phantom soundtrack to her endless waiting. Sophie's bright eyes and Lucy's mischievous grin were etched in her mind as vividly as the day they vanished. The shrill ring of the phone broke through the silence like a gunshot. Emily jumped, her heart slamming against her ribs. The phone's bright screen glowed from the corner of the kitchen counter, and she stared at it as if it might vanish if she blinked. In the static calm of her life, any unexpected call was a herald of bad news, another disappointment in a long string of false hopes. But the name that lit up the display made her breath catch. Detective Carter. She hadn't heard from him in years, not since he'd told her gently, with sympathetic eyes, that there were no new leads. Her hands shook as she reached for the receiver, her mind whirling with 1,000 questions and a single fragile hope she'd never let herself voice. "Hello?" Her voice cracked on the word, like a dry twig underfoot. She heard Ethan's footsteps behind her, felt his presence like a steadying weight as he stepped into the doorway, his face drawn and pale. She didn't dare look at him, not yet. "Emily!" Detective Carter's voice was low, but there was an undercurrent of something urgent, something that made her stomach twist. "I know this is sudden, but we have new information about your daughters." For a moment, the world narrowed to that single sentence. Emily's vision swam, and she gripped the edge of the table to keep from sinking to her knees. "New information," she repeated, barely a whisper. The phrase felt like a foreign language, like a cruel joke. After 20 years of empty leads and polite rejections, how could there be anything new? Ethan's hand found her shoulder, his touch gentle but grounding. "What kind of information?" he asked, his voice steady, though his fingers trembled where they rested against her skin. "I can't go into it over the phone," Detective Carter said carefully, as if the words themselves were fragile glass. "I need you and Ethan to come down to the station as soon as you can." Emily's mind reeled. She could almost hear the echo of her daughter's laughter in the next room, see them rushing down the stairs in matching red and white uniforms, breathless with excitement for the competition that would change everything. She felt the hollow ache in her chest, the weight of years spent clutching at shadows. But beneath the fear, a flicker of light sparked to life, hope, raw and painful. "We'll be there," she said, her voice hoarse but resolute. She ended the call and turned to Ethan, their eyes locking in silent understanding. In that moment, the years of cautious denial fell away. They would go. They had to. As they moved to gather their things, Ethan reached for the car keys while Emily slipped on her thin cardigan, though she knew the Arizona sun was already beginning to scorch the pavement outside. She paused, hand on the doorknob, feeling the cool brass beneath her fingertips, a final moment of hesitation before stepping out of the quiet, haunted stillness of their home. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, his voice soft, but laced with an urgency that mirrored her own. She nodded once, a single definitive motion. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice trembling. "But we have to be." They stepped outside into the bright blaze of the day, the Arizona air dry and shimmering with heat. Emily blinked against the light, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on her shoulders, but she squared her jaw and took Ethan's hand. Today, the silence would end. Today, they would start to unravel the darkness that had swallowed their lives whole. The path ahead was uncertain, but Emily knew one thing with unwavering clarity. She would not stop until she found the truth. The drive to the police station felt like moving through a waking dream. The sun was already climbing high over Fairview, the wide Arizona sky a searing blue. But the world inside the car was hushed, cloaked in a tension that pulsed with every breath. Emily watched the familiar landmarks blur past, the gas station where she used to buy slushies for the girls after practice, the quiet neighborhood library where she'd spent countless afternoons lost in books she no longer had the heart to read. Each one was a memory of a life paused mid-sentence, waiting for a chapter that refused to be written. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the dark leather. Neither of them spoke, but in the heavy silence hung every word they couldn't say. What if it was another dead end? What if this time was different? What if... The police station loomed ahead, a squat, unassuming building with a flag snapping in the hot breeze. Emily felt a shiver despite the heat, a ripple of foreboding that crawled up her spine. As they pulled into the lot, she saw them. Familiar faces weathered by time and grief, drawn together again after so many years apart. Linda and Robert Wilson stood arm in arm, their faces etched with the same blend of hope and exhaustion she saw in Ethan's eyes. Linda's hair was streaked with silver now, a testament to the decades that had passed, but her posture was as proud and determined as ever. Nearby, Mr. and Mrs. Clark sat close on a bench, his hand covering hers in a silent promise of support. Mrs. Carter, mother of the spirited Rachel, clutched a worn leather journal to her chest, her talisman against the endless unknown. As Emily stepped out of the car, the weight of the gathering pressed against her chest, but she drew in a steadying breath. These were the only people in the world who could truly understand, who knew the bone-deep ache of searching for a child who'd vanished without a trace. Ethan took her hand as they walked across the cracked asphalt. The door to the station opened with a quiet squeal, and Detective Carter appeared, his face solemn but not unkind. His eyes swept over the assembled parents, and Emily thought she saw a flicker of something in them. Regret, maybe, or determination. He gestured for them to come inside. The air conditioning inside was a shock of cool against Emily's flushed skin. The sterile scent of coffee and disinfectant clung to the narrow hallway, familiar and yet alien. Detective Carter led them to a small conference room at the end of the hall, its beige walls closing in around them, like the walls of an interrogation cell. Emily took a seat beside Ethan, her hands twisting in her lap. Around her, the other parents did the same, the room filling with the quiet rustle of clothing, the scratch of chairs against the floor. For a moment, no one spoke, each of them lost in their own memories, their own silent prayers. Linda was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling but steady. "Detective Carter," she said, her hand resting protectively on her husband's knee. "Please, tell us why we're here. Don't keep us in the dark any longer." Detective Carter looked around the table, his jaw set. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he began, his voice carrying a gravity that filled the room. "I know how difficult this is, but I promise you, we've found something that may finally give us the answers we've been searching for." A ripple of breath moved through the room, hope, fear, disbelief. Emily felt her pulse quicken, her mind already racing ahead. Could it be? After so many years of waiting, of watching the calendar pages turn while their children's faces remained frozen in time, could this be the break that would shatter the silence at last? She reached for Ethan's hand under the table, their fingers weaving together in a desperate, silent promise. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. Detective Carter's fingers drummed lightly on the edge of the table, a rhythm of nerves barely contained by the weight of the moment. Around the room, every parent leaned forward, their faces pale, their breaths held in a collective hush that made the air itself feel brittle. Emily could feel her heart thudding in her chest, each beat echoing like a hammer blow in her ears. "We've recovered something," Carter said, his voice steady but carrying a note of gravity that drew every ear closer. He reached for the laptop in front of him, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he opened a series of photos. With a few keystrokes, he turned the screen to face them, and in the sudden glow of the images, the entire room seemed to go still. On the screen was a photograph of a battered, rusted metal suitcase, half buried in the golden sand of the Sonoran Desert. The sun in the photo was harsh and unflinching, casting long shadows that made the scene seem almost otherworldly, like a grave left open to the sky. Emily drew in a sharp breath. She recognized the shape of that case, though she had never seen it before. It was the kind of container that spoke of hidden things, of finality. A chill snaked down her spine, and her fingers tightened around Ethan's hand beneath the table. Detective Carter's voice dropped to a near whisper. This suitcase was discovered by a hiker yesterday morning, about 50 kilometers outside Fairview. He and his dog were wandering off the beaten path when they caught the scent of something beneath the sand. Emily's mouth felt dry as she leaned in closer, her eyes locked on the suitcase as though it might blink back at her. What was in it? She forced herself to ask, though part of her already knew the answer. Carter's gaze flicked to her, his expression gentle but unflinching. Inside, he said, clicking to the next image, we found uniforms. The photograph shifted, revealing a jumble of red and white fabric, cheerleading uniforms, faded and frayed at the edges, but unmistakable. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and a soft cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. The colors were dulled with time and dirt, but she could still see the familiar logo stitched into the chest, still see the bright letters that once spelled out the name of a team that had filled her daughter's lives with laughter and competition. Linda Wilson's hand flew to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Mr. Clark let out a ragged breath, his eyes going glassy with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. All around the table, the parents clutched at one another, united by a grief that was no longer abstract, but here, tangible, dirty with the dust of the desert. Emily's vision blurred with tears, but she refused to look away. She wanted to burn the image of that suitcase into her mind. Proof that after 2 decades of not knowing, something real had finally surfaced. How long do you think it's been there? She asked, her voice trembling. Carter hesitated for just a moment before he answered. Based on the state of the uniforms and the shallow burial, we believe it was placed there within the last year. A gasp rippled through the room. Emily felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers, the weight of his grip an anchor in the sudden storm of shock. After 20 years of emptiness, to think that these uniforms had been buried only recently. Someone had hidden them, long after the girls had disappeared. Someone who still walked free. The unspoken horror settled in the room like dust. Detective Carter's face was grave, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes that Emily hadn't seen in years. We're not stopping here, he said quietly, but with a steel edge in his tone. This is the first real lead we've had in a long time, and we're going to find out who buried those uniforms, and why. Emily's throat tightened. The room was still, heavy with fear and fragile hope. But for the first time in years, she felt the tiniest spark of something else, a sense that the truth was finally close enough to touch. The conference room felt even smaller as Detective Carter's words sank in, the weight of them settling into the cracks of the parents' tired hearts. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down in relentless waves, but inside, the air seemed colder, charged with a sharp electricity that set Emily's skin prickling. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. Ethan leaned close, his voice low and urgent. We need to see it for ourselves, Emily, he said, his jaw set in that way that told her he wouldn't be talked out of it. She nodded, her throat tight. They had waited so long for even a scrap of evidence. She couldn't bear the thought of standing on the sidelines now. Detective Carter hesitated for a moment, weighing their silent plea. Then he gave a curt nod. We're heading out there in an hour, he said. I won't stop you from coming, but I need you to understand. This is still an active investigation. Stay behind the tape, don't touch anything, and be prepared. You may not like what you see. Emily's heart thudded in her chest. She turned to see Linda Wilson's tear-streaked face, her hands clutched to her chest as she whispered a quiet prayer. Mr. Clark stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched as though he could feel the weight of the desert already pressing down on him. Around the room, every parent wore the same expression, a fragile mask of composure that could shatter with a single word. An hour later, they climbed into a convoy of cars and police SUVs that stretched like a funeral procession through the town. Emily watched the familiar streets slip away, the little grocery store with the hand-painted sign, the dusty basketball courts where Sophie and Lucy used to practice cartwheels in the fading evening light. Each landmark felt like a farewell to the safety of the known world. As they left Fairview behind, the landscape shifted. Neat suburban lawns gave way to scrubby desert brush. The earth baked and cracked in the heat. Saguaro cacti rose like silent sentinels, their arms outstretched to the endless sky. Emily rolled down the window, and the dry wind rushed in, full of the scent of sun-warmed earth, and something older, wilder. Ethan reached for her hand as they drove, his grip a steadying weight. Neither of them spoke. There were no words big enough to name the roiling mix of fear and hope that churned in Emily's chest. She stared out at the horizon, the sun a white blaze that made her squint, and wondered how something so bright could exist in a world that had swallowed her daughters whole. Finally, the convoy turned onto a narrow dirt road, the tires kicking up plumes of fine red dust that hung in the air like a shroud. In the distance, she could see the flicker of movement, uniformed officers setting up a perimeter, the glint of sun on metal as they secured the site. When the cars came to a stop, Emily stepped out, her legs trembling. The desert heat wrapped around her like a smothering blanket, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the yellow police tape flapping lazily in the breeze, and beyond it, the shallow pit where the suitcase had been unearthed. A white forensic tent billowed gently in the hot wind, ghostly and stark against the sun-baked ground. Emily took a deep breath, tasting the dust on her tongue, and forced herself to walk forward. She could feel the eyes of the other parents on her, the shared strength that bound them all together in this terrible pilgrimage. As she neared the perimeter, Detective Carter stepped forward to meet her, his face drawn but resolute. "We'll let you see it," he said quietly, "but I need you to prepare yourselves. This is just the beginning." Emily swallowed hard, her pulse a steady roar in her ears. She reached for Ethan's hand and gave it a small squeeze. "We've been preparing for this day for 20 years, she said, her voice low but steady. "We're ready to face whatever comes next." And with that, they stepped under the tape, into the heart of the desert's secrets. Emily's breath caught as she stepped beyond the police tape, the brittle line between the world she had known and the one that had stolen her daughters dissolving beneath her feet. The desert seemed to expand and contract around her, the shimmering heat warping the edges of the scene like a mirage, but the chill that crept along her spine was real. The ground beneath the forensic tent was marked by careful lines of disturbed earth, crimson dirt that had been sifted and examined, turned over like pages in a story she wasn't sure she wanted to read. She could smell the metallic tang of sweat and dust, hear the low murmur of officers moving purposefully, their voices hushed but urgent. The suitcase itself was gone, already transported back to the lab for testing, but the hollow in the earth where it had lain gaped like an open wound. Emily knelt at the edge of the shallow pit, the sun beating down on her shoulders, and let her fingers hover over the disturbed soil. She didn't touch it, but she felt it all the same, the weight of every year, every unanswered question pressing down on her chest. Detective Carter stood nearby, his gaze following her every movement. "The uniforms were in remarkably good condition," he said quietly. "Whoever buried them didn't do a very good job of hiding them." Ethan stood behind her, his shadow a silent testament of strength. "Why now?" he asked, his voice tight. "After all these years, why would someone dig them up or move them here?" Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're working on that. But one thing is clear. Someone wanted these uniforms to stay hidden, but they didn't bury them deeply enough. It's almost like they wanted to come back for them." Emily's throat tightened. She could see it in her mind. Someone standing here in the moonlight, their breath fogging in the cold desert air, shoveling dirt in frantic handfuls, sweat and desperation mingling with the dust. Someone who had stood exactly where she stood now, but with a secret she couldn't begin to comprehend. A movement near the edge of the site drew her attention. Logan, the hiker who had found the suitcase, stood with his dog Dusty, the animal's keen eyes alert and watchful. Logan's face was weathered by sun and wind, but in his eyes was the same haunted look she saw every time she glimpsed her own reflection. "I never thought I'd find something like that," he said softly, his voice carrying over the quiet rustle of the desert wind. "I was just out here to clear my head, but Dusty wouldn't stop digging." Emily met his eyes and managed a small nod of gratitude. "You gave us back a piece of them," she said, her voice raw. "Even if it's not the piece we wanted." Logan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I hope it helps," he murmured. "I really do." She turned back to the shallow pit, her mind spinning. The uniforms, so bright and full of promise on the night they disappeared, had become relics of a life stolen away. She tried to imagine Sophie and Lucy wearing them again, their laughter echoing through the night, but the memory was smudged by years of doubt and darkness. Ethan knelt beside her, his hand finding hers. "We're not giving up," he whispered fiercely. "We'll find the rest of the story, Emily. I swear it." She nodded, blinking back tears. The sun burned overhead, the light almost cruel in its brilliance. Around them, the desert stretched on forever, its secrets buried beneath layers of sand and time. But Emily knew one thing with a clarity that cut through the haze of grief. They were closer than they had ever been, and she would dig as deep as she had to until the truth was finally laid bare. Emily and Ethan stood a moment longer, staring into the pit as though the weight of all those missing years lay coiled within it. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust, and Emily shivered despite the heat. She could almost feel the pulse of the past beneath her feet, echoes of that long-ago night when everything changed. A murmur rippled through the group as a car door slammed shut nearby. Emily looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. Striding toward them with an air of brisk authority was a figure she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. Coach Reed. His hair, once a deep brown, was now shot through with silver at the temples, but he moved with the same athletic confidence he'd always carried. His eyes, however, were shadowed, hard to read in the bright glare of the desert sun. He wore a light jacket despite the heat, and when he caught sight of Emily and Ethan, he offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Emily, Ethan," he said, his voice calm and measured. "It's been a long time." Emily's pulse quickened, her skin prickling with a cold sweat. She remembered the way he used to stand on the sidelines of the cheer competitions, his whistle slung around his neck, his encouragement ringing in her daughter's ears. Back then, she'd trusted him. Back then, he'd been a part of their community, a trusted mentor, a figure of strength. Now, standing here in the shimmering heat, she wasn't sure what she saw in him. Ethan's hand found the small of her back, a subtle gesture of support. "Coach Reed," he said evenly, "we didn't expect to see you here." Reed's eyes flicked over the excavation site, his lips tightening into a frown. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, his voice taking on a note of regret. "Those girls, they were like family to me. I had to be here." His words fell into the silence like a stone. Emily studied his face, searching for cracks in his calm veneer. His tone was sympathetic, but there was something else there too, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, a shadow in the depths of his gaze. Detective Carter stepped forward, his posture subtly protective. "Coach Reed, thank you for coming. We're still processing the scene, but if you have any memories, anything that might help—" "I'll do whatever I can," Reed said smoothly, his eyes meeting Carter's. "Anything to help find out what happened to those girls." Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him, to cling to the idea that this man who'd once cheered for her daughters was as lost and searching as they were. But as she watched him, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes darted too quickly from the pit to the gathered parents, unease coiled in her chest. The parents, clustered in a small knot, watched the exchange with wary eyes. Linda Wilson's fingers twisted the strap of her purse, her lips a thin line of suspicion. Mr. Clark shifted his weight, his gaze never leaving Coach Reed's face. Reed seemed to feel their scrutiny, and he spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "I know how this must look," he said quietly, his voice softening, "but I promise you, I've never stopped thinking about them, about Sophie, Lucy, all of them. I'm here because I want answers too." Emily's throat felt tight, her thoughts spinning. She wanted to believe him, but the memory of those uniforms buried in the desert, the fresh dirt that had covered them, was too raw. She remembered the easy charm he'd once wielded, the way he'd made everyone feel safe, like he had all the answers. But now she wasn't sure if the answers he held were the ones they wanted to hear. Detective Carter's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he stepped away to answer it, his brow furrowing as he listened. In the brief moment of distraction, Coach Reed turned back to Emily and Ethan, his eyes solemn. "I swear to you," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "Whatever I can do, I'll do it. We owe those girls that much." Emily managed a small nod, though her stomach twisted with uncertainty. As Reed moved to speak with the other parents, she looked up at Ethan, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "Do you trust him?" she asked, her fingers clutching at his sleeve. Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes never leaving Reed's retreating figure. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but we'll find out, one way or another." In the pit, the dust still whispered of secrets, and the desert sun beat down with a merciless heat. Emily squared her shoulders, the flicker of fear in her chest hardening into resolve. Whatever truths lay hidden here, she would not turn away. She had come too far, and this time she would see it through to the end. Emily could still feel the weight of Coach Reed's words echoing in her ears as she and Ethan turned to leave the site. She tried to steady her breath, the image of the battered uniforms etched into her mind like a brand. The sun was climbing higher, harsh and unrelenting, but she barely felt the heat anymore. Her mind was consumed by the churn of questions that had no answers. She and Ethan walked back to the car in silence, each step stirring up the fine red dust of the desert. Their thoughts were 1,000 miles away, back in a time when Sophie and Lucy's laughter had filled their home instead of these heavy silences. But as they neared the cars, Emily's gaze snagged on something in the distance. 3 men, moving in the shimmering heat like wraiths against the landscape. They were off the main path, partially obscured by a low rise of rock and brush. She squinted against the glare, her heart skipping a beat. One of them was dragging something heavy and shapeless, bundled in a dark canvas sack that kicked up small clouds of dust with every jarring tug. Ethan followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "What are they doing out here?" he murmured. Emily shook her head, her mouth suddenly dry. "They're not part of the police," she whispered, her voice tight with sudden fear. "Ethan, look at them." The men moved with a furtive urgency, heads bent, voices low. One was crouched near a cluster of rocks, digging with a small spade, his shoulders tense with effort. The others scanned the horizon nervously, their eyes flicking back and forth, as if they were waiting for something or someone to catch them. Emily felt a cold knot form in her gut. Everything about them was wrong. In this place of grief and searching, their movements were deliberate, secretive, like ghosts that didn't belong to the world of the living. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her instinct screaming at her to understand, to find out what these strangers were doing here in the heart of her nightmare. "Emily," Ethan said sharply, grabbing her arm. "Don't." The detective said to stay close. "I can't just stand here," she snapped, her voice shaking. "What if this is connected? What if they're hiding something about Sophie and Lucy?" Before Ethan could answer, she was already moving, her footsteps crunching softly in the sand. She didn't call out at first. She wanted to get closer, to see the truth with her own eyes before it vanished again. As they drew nearer, one of the men looked up and spotted them. His face went pale beneath the grime of the desert, and he barked a sharp warning to his companions. The man with the spade froze, his eyes wide with something like panic, and in a sudden flurry of movement, he kicked the sack away and started to backpedal. Emily raised her hand in a small, almost desperate wave. "Hello!" she called, her voice cracking in the dry air. "Who are you? What are you doing out here?" But the reaction was immediate and terrifying. The man near the rocks dropped the spade, his expression twisting from surprise to alarm. The third man lunged for the sack, heaving it into the back of a battered pickup truck as the engine roared to life. Dust exploded around them as the vehicle lurched forward, the tires spitting grit into the air. "Ethan!" Emily gasped, her heart thundering in her chest as the truck swung around in a spray of dirt, the 3 men clambering inside. For a heartbeat, she locked eyes with one of them, a narrow face, a scruff of dark beard, and a glint of something cold and calculating in his eyes. And then they were gone, tearing away down the rough track, leaving only the swirling dust and a silence that rang in her ears. Ethan pulled her back a step, his hand tight on her shoulder. "What the hell was that?" he breathed. Emily shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but whatever they're doing, it's not innocent. We have to tell Detective Carter." She turned back to where the men had been, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground there was still disturbed, the small hole half covered by loose dirt. She dropped to her knees, clawing at the earth with shaking hands. In the soft sand, something small and hard caught her fingers, a glint of silver. She pulled it free and held it up in the harsh sunlight. It was a small earring, tarnished and dulled by years in the ground, a tiny silver star with a ruby-red stone at its center. Emily's breath caught in her throat, tears stinging her eyes. She knew this piece of jewelry as surely as she knew her own name. She had given it to Sophie and Lucy for their 13th birthday, matching earrings for the two bright stars of her life. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's Lucy's." He knelt beside her, his face pale, and took the earring from her trembling fingers. For a moment, they just stared at it together, the small, perfect thing that connected them to their lost daughter. And in that moment, Emily felt the truth settle cold and heavy in her chest. Whoever those men were, they knew something, and she would not let them take that truth away. Emily's hand shook as she cradled the small earring, the glint of the ruby-red stone catching in the harsh Arizona sun. It felt like a lifeline and a dagger all at once, proof that Lucy had been here, or that someone wanted them to believe she had. Her mind reeled with the possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Ethan took the earring gently from her fingers, his own hand steady even as his eyes brimmed with unspoken grief. "We have to tell Detective Carter," he said quietly, his voice hardening with resolve. "This isn't just a piece of jewelry. It's a message, or a warning." Emily nodded, swallowing the tightness in her throat. "We can't let them get away with this," she whispered, her gaze sweeping over the spot where the men had stood. The ground was still disturbed, the faint shape of the canvas sack visible in the dust like a bruise on the earth. They rose together, moving quickly back toward the makeshift command post, where Detective Carter was conferring with a group of officers. The detective looked up as they approached, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Emily's pale face and the small object in Ethan's hand. "Detective," Ethan called out, his voice clipped with urgency. "We saw something. 3 men, not part of your team. They were digging near those rocks, and when they saw us, they ran. But before they left, Emily found this." He held out the earring, and Carter took it carefully, his brow furrowing as he turned it over in his hand. This belonged to one of your daughters?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded, her voice catching. "Lucy, I gave it to her for her birthday, 20 years ago. There's no way it just ended up out here by accident." Carter's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with a flicker of something that made Emily's pulse quicken. He turned to one of the officers at his side, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "Get a team back over there. Mark the location and start a thorough search. I want tire tracks, footprints, anything. Those men didn't just stumble onto this place." The officer nodded and jogged off, and Carter turned back to Emily and Ethan. "Did you get a good look at them? Anything that might help us identify them?" Emily hesitated, replaying the scene in her mind, the way the man at the truck had stared at her, the glint of sun off the logo on the back window. "There was something on their truck," she said, her voice growing stronger. "A logo. Letters. CPF, I think." Carter's head snapped up, his eyes sharp. "CPF," he repeated slowly. "Carway Performance and Fitness?" Emily blinked, taken aback. "Yes, that's what it said. Do you know them?" Carter drew in a deep breath, his shoulders tensing. "It's a business owned by Vincent Carway," he said carefully. "He was the coach for the girls' cheer squad. Back then." Emily felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. "Coach Reed?" she whispered, the name tasting bitter on her tongue. She remembered his calm smile, the way he'd spoken at the desert site, promising to help. She remembered the glimmer of something else in his eyes, something she hadn't wanted to believe. "Carway's been on our radar before," Carter said, his voice low. "He funded the early search efforts when the girls first disappeared, but his name has come up in a few unusual ways over the years. Nothing we could pin down. But if his company is connected to those men out here..." He trailed off, his expression grim. Ethan's hand tightened around Emily's. "What do we do now?" he asked. Carter met their eyes, his gaze steady. "We follow the trail. This isn't just about finding out what happened 20 years ago. It's about stopping whoever is trying to keep it buried now." Emily nodded, her pulse a steady roar in her ears. She could feel it in her bones, the sense that the truth was close, that it was shifting just beneath the surface, waiting for them to dig deep enough to unearth it. As Carter moved away to give orders, Emily turned to Ethan, her voice a low whisper. "Do you think he knew?" she asked. "Coach Reed, do you think he was lying to us all these years?" Ethan's eyes were hard, but there was sorrow there too. "I don't know," he said softly. "But we're going to find out. We're not stopping now." Emily swallowed, steeling herself against the rush of fear and determination that surged through her. She slipped the earring into her pocket, feeling its weight against her skin. a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she was willing to fight for. Above them, the desert sun burned bright and merciless, but Emily knew that some truths couldn't be hidden forever, and she was ready to chase them, no matter where they led. As the sun crept higher in the sky, turning the desert air into a shimmering furnace, Emily and Ethan followed Detective Carter back to the makeshift command center, set up in the shade of a battered pop-up tent. Officers moved like restless spirits around them, securing equipment, snapping photographs, and marking tire tracks in the dust with bright yellow evidence flags. Emily clutched the edge of the tent pole, her knuckles white. The small silver earring in her pocket felt like a talisman and a curse all at once. A single, undeniable piece of their daughter's world, buried in a place it should never have been. Carter leaned over a map spread across a folding table, tracing the winding dirt roads that branched out like veins from the spot where the suitcase had been found. His brow was furrowed in concentration, sweat glistening on his temples. "We know they left in a hurry," he said, his voice low but commanding. "The tracks from that pickup truck head west, toward the old Lafferty cattle range. It's been abandoned for years, but it's private land, and it's the only structure within 10 miles. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You think they're hiding there?" Carter glanced up, his eyes hard. "It's a strong possibility. Whoever those men were, they knew this desert better than most. And they didn't expect to be seen today." Emily felt her pulse quicken. The thought of those men, so close, so deliberate, sent a shiver down her spine. She could still see the face of the one who had stared at her from the truck, his eyes cold and calculating. "We have to go there," she said, her voice low but steady. "We can't let them slip away again." Carter studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'm going to take a team out there, but I need you and Ethan to stay back. If these men are involved, they're dangerous. I can't risk you getting caught in the crossfire." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan's hand on her arm stopped her. "He's right," he said gently. "We need to let them handle this. But we'll be right here, ready to do whatever it takes." Emily swallowed hard, the bitter taste of fear rising in her throat. She nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to fight, to demand to be there when they found the answers. But she forced herself to remember the trembling weight of the earring in her hand and the promise she had made to herself when she'd seen those uniforms in the desert dust. She would not let this trail go cold. As Carter prepared his team, another officer approached, a young woman with a clipboard and a headset. "Detective, we've got a preliminary read on that CPF logo," she said quickly. "It's registered to Carway Performance and Fitness, but the address linked to that logo hasn't been used in over 15 years. There's another connection, though. One of Carway's former business partners, Matthew Rands. He's listed as the current property manager for the Lafferty Range." The name sent a ripple of unease through Emily's chest. Matthew Rands. She'd never met him, but she had heard the name in passing. Whispers of someone who'd handled the money, who'd stayed out of sight when things got complicated. Carter's eyes narrowed. "We need to find Rands," he said sharply. "He may be the key to unraveling this. If he's still connected to Carway, he's either part of the cover-up or knows enough to blow it wide open." Emily pressed her lips together, her mind racing. She thought of the men in the truck, of the earring glinting in the dust. She thought of Sophie and Lucy, of the laughter that had once filled their house. And she thought of Coach Reed, of the calm way he'd promised to help, even as shadows clung to his every word. "Detective," she said quietly, her voice trembling but clear. "Whoever buried those uniforms, whoever left this earring, they want us to stop looking. We can't let them scare us into silence." Carter met her gaze, his expression softening for just a moment. "I know," he said, his voice firm. "We're not stopping, Emily. Not now." As the tactical team geared up, Emily and Ethan stood side by side, their hands clasped tight. The desert wind gusted around them, warm and dry, carrying the scent of dust and something else. Something like old secrets finally stirring from their graves. In that moment, Emily felt a fierce clarity settle in her chest. The road ahead was dangerous and uncertain, but she would not turn away. Whatever waited for them at the Lafferty Range, she was ready to face it, because this was no longer just about the past. It was about the future she would fight for, no matter how deep the darkness went. The tactical team moved with precise, quiet urgency, the click of weapons and the murmur of radios blending into the hum of the desert wind. Emily stood just outside the perimeter, the edge of the dusty road beneath her feet feeling like a tightrope. One misstep, and she knew the fragile hope they carried could shatter like glass. The sun was dipping low, the sky turning a bruised purple as dusk crept over the desert. Long shadows stretched across the cracked earth, making the old cattle range loom like a fortress of secrets. The main building was a crumbling shell of weathered wood and sagging rooflines, its windows dark and watchful. Detective Carter stepped away from his team to speak with Emily and Ethan, his expression sober but resolute. "We're going in now," he said, his voice low. "If these men are here, we'll find them. But you two, this is where you stay. No arguments." Emily swallowed, her throat dry as dust. She could see the determination in Carter's eyes, but she also saw the flicker of fear. She knew he understood what was at stake, not just evidence, but the last fragile link to the daughters they had spent decades mourning. "Please," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "If you find anything at all, tell us. We've waited so long." Carter nodded once. "You'll be the first to know." Then he turned, giving a sharp signal to his team, and they moved forward like shadows slipping through the twilight. Emily watched them disappear into the darkened doorway of the old ranch house, her breath caught in her chest. She could feel the desert settle around them, the hush of the evening broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the soft crunch of boots on gravel. Beside her, Ethan stood tall and silent, his hand resting on the small of her back, a quiet promise that they would face whatever came next, together. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. The sun sank lower, turning the sky to molten gold, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Then a crackle burst from one of the radios, Carter's voice low but urgent. "We're inside. There's evidence of recent activity. Food, water, supplies. Someone's been here." Emily's heart leapt, and she strained to hear every word. She could picture it in her mind's eye, the shadows of the old barn, the dust swirling in the fading light, the ghosts of those who had been here, who might still be here. Another voice came through the radio, one of the officers. "Sir, we found a hidden room. It's locked." Emily's pulse quickened, and she clutched Ethan's hands so hard her knuckles turned white. "A hidden room," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft hiss of the radio. "Do you think—" She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. She could only watch as the last rays of sunlight bled away, leaving the desert in shadow. "Stand by," Carter's voice crackled again. "We're breaching the door." The seconds dragged like hours. Emily could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the hot, dry air burning her throat with every breath. She could feel the weight of the desert pressing in around them, like the earth itself was holding its secrets close. Then came the hollow bang of a door forced open, the dull echo carrying across the scrubland. A pause, silence. Then a voice, muffled but clear enough. "Sir, you need to see this." Emily felt the ground sway beneath her feet. She stared at the radio in Carter's hand as if it were a lifeline. She didn't know what waited inside that room. Answers, more questions, or something that would break her heart all over again. Ethan pulled her close, his voice a soft rumble in her ear. "Whatever they find, we'll face it together." She nodded, swallowing the tears that threatened to spill. The desert night was closing in around them, but Emily was no longer afraid of the darkness. She was ready to face whatever lay inside that hidden room, because she knew, with every breath, that the truth could not be buried forever. And tonight, the desert would give up its secrets. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she clung to Ethan's hand, her eyes locked on the radio that crackled with Detective Carter's urgent voice. Around them, the desert seemed to fall into a deeper silence, the fading light turning the dust to dull gold as the last rays of sun vanished behind the distant hills. In the distance, the flickering beam of a flashlight danced across the broken doorway of the ranch house, revealing flashes of worn wood and cobwebbed beams. Emily's heart thundered in her chest, the rush of blood in her ears loud enough to drown out everything else. She could almost see the hidden room in her mind's eye, dark, airless, filled with the echoes of every unspoken nightmare she'd carried for 20 years. "Detective!" A voice crackled through the radio again, one of the officers, his tone taut with something that sent a chill crawling up Emily's spine. "We're inside. There's a locked trunk in here. It looks old, but it's been moved recently." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers. She could feel the tremor in his hand, the unspoken fear that whatever lay inside that trunk would shatter them both all over again. But she knew, too, that she had to see it, had to face whatever truth had been sealed away in the dark. Carter's voice came through, steady and resolute. "Open it, carefully." There was a long moment of silence, punctuated only by the distant howl of the wind. Emily felt her mouth go dry, her chest aching with the weight of too many memories. She thought of the small silver earring in her pocket, the laughter of her daughters that she still heard in her dreams. She thought of the faces of the other parents, lined with the same grief and hope that lived in her own heart. Then, finally, a muffled thud, the dull scrape of metal on wood. A pause. "Detective?" The officer's voice came again, softer now, tinged with something that made Emily's stomach lurch. "You need to see this. There are photographs, journals, and uniforms, more uniforms." Emily's breath caught. She felt her knees go weak, and Ethan's arm slipped around her waist, steadying her. "They're hers," she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. "They're theirs." Carter's voice was calm, but she could hear the strain beneath it. "We're securing the room," he said, each word a promise. "Emily, Ethan, I know you want to see this, but let us process it first. I need to make sure it's safe." Emily nodded numbly, though every part of her was screaming to run, to push past the tape and the officers and find her way into that room, to see with her own eyes what had been hidden for so long. Ethan pressed his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. "We're close," he murmured, the weight of years in his voice. "I can feel it. This is the truth we've been chasing." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she blinked them back, drawing in a shuddering breath. "I'm scared," she admitted softly. "What if the truth is worse than what we imagined?" Ethan's eyes were gentle, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. "Then we'll face it," he said simply. Together, the minutes stretched on, every second a lifetime. Emily felt the weight of the desert around her, the endless sky, the ancient stones, the secrets that had lain buried in the dust. She thought of the girls, of Sophie and Lucy, of their bright eyes and bright futures, and she knew that whatever waited in that room, she had to see it through. At last, Carter emerged from the shadows, his expression grim but resolute. He held a small box in his gloved hands, its surface scuffed and worn with age. "We found this," he said quietly. "Inside, photographs, records, things that belong to the girls. We're cataloging everything, but, Emily, I thought you should see this first." He handed her a single photograph, faded and curled at the edges, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Sophie and Lucy, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera in their cheer uniforms. Behind them, the sun was just setting, painting the sky in gold and rose. Emily pressed the photograph to her chest, her tears falling silent and unbidden. She felt Ethan's arm tighten around her, his own breath hitching in the quiet. This was it, the crack in the darkness. The piece of light that proved the past was real, that their girls had lived, had laughed, had been here. And now, the shadows that had swallowed them were finally giving up their secrets. Emily lifted her head, her eyes shining with a fierce, unbroken light. "We're not stopping," she said, her voice steady. "We're going to bring them home." And in the gathering dark, she felt the desert itself holding its breath, waiting for the story that was finally ready to be told. Emily's heart raced as she clutched the photograph to her chest, the image of Sophie and Lucy, a fragile thread pulling her back from the brink. Around her, the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of secrets that had been buried too long. The sun had vanished beyond the desert hills, leaving the sky a deep indigo, and, in the darkness, the old ranch house loomed like a shadowed promise. Detective Carter stood close, the box of evidence in his hands a silent testament to the truth he was determined to unearth. "Emily, Ethan," he said gently, his voice low, "we're still going through everything. But there's something else you need to see. Something we found in that trunk." He led them away from the huddle of officers and forensic lights to a small table set up at the edge of the scene. On it lay a battered cassette player, its plastic casing cracked with age. Beside it, a single cassette tape sat in a clear evidence bag, the label faded to near illegibility. Emily's breath caught. A tape, one that hadn't been there 20 years ago. "It was with the journals," Carter explained. "We haven't played it yet. We thought you should be the first to hear it." Ethan's hand closed around hers, his grip warm and sure. Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry as she reached out with trembling fingers. Carter carefully removed the tape from the bag and slid it into the player with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the desert hush. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft whir of the tape spooling, the scratch of static that made Emily's skin crawl. Then, a voice, faint, muffled, but unmistakably female. "Mom, Dad," the voice cracked, a sob caught in the words. "If you're hearing this, I hope, oh God, I hope it means someone found this." Emily gasped, her knees going weak. She felt Ethan's arm slip around her shoulders, steadying her as the voice, her daughter's voice, washed over her like a wave of cold water and fire all at once. "It's Sophie," the recording said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "We're alive, or we were. They're keeping us here in the dark. We don't know where we are. It's so cold, and the days run together like a nightmare." The voice broke then, a ragged breath that cut Emily to the bone. "They're watching us all the time. We tried to escape, but they found out. Lucy's so scared, but she's trying to be brave. We're trying too." A sob tore from Emily's throat. She pressed her hand over her mouth, her shoulders shaking as the recording continued. "I don't know if this will ever reach you," Sophie's voice whispered, the words barely audible over the hiss of static. "But I need you to know, we didn't give up. We're still fighting. We're still hoping you'll find us." The tape ended in a crackle of silence, the final words hanging in the air like a ghost. Emily sank to her knees, the photo of her daughters pressed to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent, as Ethan knelt beside her, his own face pale and stricken. "They were alive," she whispered, her voice raw with wonder and pain. "All this time, they were alive." Carter knelt beside them, his expression grave. "We'll find them," he said quietly. "We'll find out what happened, and we'll bring them home." Emily nodded, her tears falling to the dusty ground. In the darkness of the desert night, she felt something shift inside her, a fragile, defiant hope. The voice on the tape had cracked the silence that had held her captive for so long. It was a promise, a plea, and she would follow it wherever it led, until the truth was finally, fully hers. Because now she knew, Sophie and Lucy had never stopped fighting, and neither would she. The air had grown cold as night wrapped the desert in an uneasy stillness. Emily felt the weight of the recording like a brand on her heart, Sophie's voice still echoing in her ears, each word a fragile thread tying her to the girls she'd lost. She clutched Ethan's hand so tightly it hurt, but he didn't let go. Detective Carter rose, his face set in hard lines, his radio crackling with urgent voices as officers reported back from the old Lafferty ranch. "We've secured the entire structure," he said, his voice low and tight. "No one here now, but there's more. Hidden rooms, false walls. Whoever did this built this place to keep them out of sight for a very long time." Emily shivered, the cold of the desert night sinking into her bones. She could almost see it, the hidden chambers, the hollow spaces where the girls had been kept, their laughter stolen, and their innocence traded for secrets no one wanted to face. Ethan looked to Carter, his jaw tight with unspoken questions. "Did you find anything else? Any sign of who was behind it? Of Carway?" Carter hesitated, and for a moment Emily saw the weight of his own frustration. "We found documents," he said, "ledgers with coded entries, deliveries, payments, and more photos, too many to count. But the man who built this nightmare, he covered his tracks. We're still working on decoding the records, but one name keeps coming up, Matthew Rands." Emily's breath caught, the name again, an echo in the darkness, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. "Matthew Rands," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He was Carway's partner. They said he managed the money, kept it all buried." Carter nodded grimly. "He's not just the money. He's the architect of this whole operation, the man behind the curtain. And we believe he's still out there, moving in the shadows." A low murmur spread among the officers, the realization settling in like a weight. Emily's mind raced, her thoughts spinning back to the recording, Sophie's voice, so close, so heartbreakingly alive. She thought of the men she and Ethan had seen in the desert, of the logo on the truck, of the cold calculation in the eyes of the man who had looked back at her. "They're cleaning up," she said softly, the words falling from her lips like a confession. "Those men, they were there to hide what Rands and Carway built, to make sure no one ever found out." Carter's eyes met hers, dark and determined. "They didn't expect you to see them, Emily," he said, and that's going to be their mistake. He turned, barking orders into his radio, sending officers to search the outbuildings and the hidden cellars they were only now discovering. Emily watched as they fanned out like shadows across the property, their flashlights sweeping the darkness for answers. In the heavy silence that followed, Emily turned to Ethan, her voice low and fierce. "We have to be there," she said. "When they find him, when they bring him in, I need to look him in the eye." Ethan nodded, his own gaze unflinching. "We will. We're not turning back now." As the minutes passed, the search spread out like ripples across the desert floor. Emily stood at the edge of the command post, the earring in her pocket a small, cold weight, proof of what had been stolen, and a promise of what she would reclaim. Then a voice crackled through the radio, urgent and crackling with static. "Detective, we have movement on the east side. Someone trying to slip through the fence line." Carter's eyes snapped up. "Hold your positions," he ordered sharply. "I'm coming to you." He turned to Emily and Ethan, his voice low. "Stay here. This could be him, Rands or one of his men. If it is, I need to know what he knows. And I need you safe." Emily wanted to protest, but she swallowed her words. She knew Carter was right. If this was the moment, if the answers she had chased for 20 years were finally within reach, she couldn't risk it slipping away. So she watched as Carter and two officers slipped into the darkness, their flashlights flickering like distant stars. She listened to the desert night, the low murmur of voices, the crunch of footsteps in the dust, and she held her breath. Because she knew that whatever lay beyond that fence line, whatever waited in the darkness, it was the end of the silence, and the beginning of the truth. Emily felt her chest tighten as she watched Carter and the officers vanish into the desert night. Every breath she took was ragged, the cold air burning her lungs. She clutched the small earring in her pocket like a prayer, feeling the sharp edges bite into her palm. It was the only anchor she had left to the daughters she had lost, and the hope she still clung to. Beside her, Ethan stood tense and ready, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the edge of the property where the men had vanished. The darkness felt alive around them, heavy with secrets, and the echo of Sophie's trembling voice on the recording. Emily could almost hear it still, whispering from the shadows. "We're still fighting. We're still hoping you'll find us." A sharp crack of static burst from the radio, and Carter's voice came through, calm but edged with urgency. "We have him," he said, the words hanging in the air like a gunshot. "Matthew Rands, he's here." Emily's heart stopped. She turned to Ethan, her breath catching in her throat. "It's him," she whispered. "It's really him." The minutes that followed stretched like an eternity. The desert was utterly still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then finally she saw them, Carter and the officers, emerging from the darkness with a man between them, Matthew Rands. He was older than she remembered from the faded photos the police had shown her long ago, grayer at the temples, lines etched deep around his mouth and eyes. But there was a cold arrogance in the set of his jaw, a flicker of disdain in his eyes as he scanned the command post, as if the people around him were merely an inconvenience. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine. There was no remorse there, no flicker of regret, only a calculating coldness that made her blood run cold. Carter brought him to a stop a few feet away, the beam of his flashlight catching the sharp angles of Rands' face. "Matthew Rands," he said, his voice like steel. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." Rands didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His gaze shifted to Emily and Ethan, and for a moment, just a moment, Emily saw the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly, his voice low and venomous. "This was never meant for you." Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. "You took them from us," she said, her words ringing in the stillness. "You stole 20 years of their lives. You buried them in the dark and left us with nothing but questions." Rands tilted his head, a cold smile playing at the corners of his lips. "The desert has a way of swallowing things," he said. "People, memories, truth. It's all just dust in the end." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "Not this time," he said, his voice low and steady. "This time, the truth is coming back with us." For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the four of them: Emily, Ethan, Carter, and the man who had built a prison of lies around the lives of 6 girls. The air crackled with the weight of everything that had been lost and everything they were about to reclaim. Then Carter gave a sharp nod, and the officers moved in, handcuffing Rands and leading him toward the waiting police car. Emily watched him go, her heart thundering in her chest. There was no triumph in it, no joy. Only the knowledge that the monster who had haunted her nightmares for 2 decades was finally in chains. As the taillights of the police car vanished into the night, Emily turned to Ethan, her voice shaking with exhaustion and relief. "It's not over," she said. "But this is the beginning." Ethan pulled her close, his breath warm against her temple. "We're bringing them home," he whispered. "We're bringing them all home." And as the desert wind sighed around them, Emily knew he was right. The darkness had held them captive for too long. But tonight, the light was breaking through, and nothing would stop it now. The first light of dawn crept across the desert sky, washing the world in soft gold and rose. Emily stood at the edge of the police cordon, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun slowly rose, promising warmth and clarity after the longest night of her life. The chaos of the night had given way to a quiet hum of activity. Officers moving methodically around the ranch, documenting every piece of evidence, every footprint, every ghost that still lingered in the dust. She could hear the low murmur of voices, the crackle of radios, and the soft weeping of the other parents as they gathered around, drawn by the promise of answers. Emily felt Ethan's arm slip around her shoulders, his warmth grounding her in the moment. He pressed a soft kiss to her temple, his voice a low murmur. "It's really over," he said. "Or, at least, it's finally beginning." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We have them," she whispered. "We have the truth, and we have each other." A short distance away, Detective Carter emerged from the old barn, his face drawn but resolute. He carried a box in his hands, weathered and scarred, but precious beyond measure. Inside were the journals, the photographs, the small tokens of life that had survived the darkness. Proof of the girls' existence, of their fight, their hope, their refusal to be forgotten. "Emily," Carter said as he approached, his eyes meeting hers with a solemn tenderness. "This is yours. It's time these memories came home." She took the box with trembling hands, pressing it to her chest. The weight of it felt like a promise, and a burden she was finally ready to carry. She knew there would be years of healing ahead, for her, for Ethan, for Sophie if she was alive, for the families of the other girls who hadn't survived. But the lies were broken. The silence was ended. As the sun rose higher, the last of the search teams emerged from the hidden rooms. One of the officers carried a small bundle, tattered pieces of red and white cloth that had once been bright uniforms, once been symbols of pride and dreams. Emily reached out, her fingers brushing the worn fabric, and for a moment she could see Sophie and Lucy again, bright-eyed and fearless, their laughter echoing across the years. "I'm bringing you home," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "No more shadows, no more silence, I promise." Ethan drew her close, his arms a fortress around her trembling frame. "We'll tell their stories," he said softly. "We'll make sure the world knows what happened, and that it can never happen again." In the distance, she could hear the low rumble of a convoy, FBI agents arriving to take over the investigation, to trace every thread of this twisted conspiracy to its source. But for Emily, the most important battle had already been won. She turned back to the horizon, the desert bathed in light, and in that golden dawn, she felt something stir deep inside her, a fierce, unbreakable hope. The world had tried to bury the truth, to hide it beneath layers of fear and silence. But Emily had found it. She had torn it from the darkness and brought it blinking into the light. Sophie's voice, captured in that battered cassette, had been a lifeline, the earring, a signpost. And now, the world would know their story. The world would remember. As she stood with Ethan, the weight of the desert lifting at last, Emily whispered one final promise to her daughters, one final vow that carried through the warming air. "You were never forgotten," she said, "and you never will be." In the end, the desert could no longer keep its secrets buried. The voices of the lost have risen, and the truth has finally found its way home. As the sun sets on this story, we're left with a single promise, that hope endures, even in the deepest darkness. What did you think of this journey? Of the quiet strength that brought the truth into the light? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales from Soul Nest. Your voice matters. Let it be heard.